if I would need to state one thing that makes developers more productive than less, I would say that is independence.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 68. Is Docker back? Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. So what's this thing about Docker right now?
They're trying to reinvent themselves, or rather maybe go back to their roots, I believe, out of desire or necessity. That's hard to say at this moment. But they're going back towards targeting developers in their needs rather than companies, enterprises. I think that they're moving away from the idea of even attempting to help you run your applications in productions and focus on, let's say, developer productivity would probably be the right word.
If you haven't kept up with it, Victor, why don't you let people know what this productivity change from Docker is all about? Because it may not apply to everyone.
Yes. So the way how I would interpret the recent changes is that they're trying to enable people, us, to do with Docker, and in this context, Docker binary, the same operations as we would be normally doing in local, in laptops, or in servers that we set up manually. And to be more specific, they're targeting now interoperability between Docker binary and Azure and AWS. So they are trying to provide means for people to use Azure Container Instances and AWS CCS with Docker in a way that is, I was about to say transparent, but that is not really true because the way how those two work is quite different. But we'll get there, I guess. But for now, I think it's developer productivity by moving developers fully or partially into cloud from their laptops.
Now, we're stating it as developer productivity, but how are you defining developer productivity?
You caught me now. You caught me saying a word without really going through it well. It really depends on the type of developer. Docker in general was always, I believe, focused on developers. So we can, in a way, distinguish Docker, let's say, and even Docker Swarm on one hand and Kubernetes on the other by who is the target audience, right? Now, what I'm about to say does not mean that it's only for those people or only for those, but predominantly Docker was oriented towards individual developers. So this is how you can package your application. This is how you can run your applications and the dependencies of your application on your laptop. This is how you can create a virtual machine easily, provisioned with Docker and what's or not, and so on and so forth. Very, very simple to use, amazing user experience without too many, what is the word? Nuts and bolts or something like that, right?
That's fine. Yeah. knobs and switches. It does it and you go on.
Exactly. So Kubernetes came more from Google experience where we need to do complex operations. And for complex operations, we need a lot of things. It's not going to be easy, at least not initially. We are moving in that direction, but it's definitely not. So it's predominantly focused on sysadmins, operators, people who manage your production, let's say your cluster, often for large scale. So in this context, when I say developer productivity, I mean simplify many of the things that an average developer does, like how you're going to build your application. Well, it's not going to be Maven this and that, it's going to be Docker build. How you're going to deploy dependent database on your laptop. Well, it's going to be Docker run, right? How are you going to combine that database with your application? It can be Docker compose. I could even argue operations that are not so complex today or before Docker, but they're made even easier than that.
I think that's the thing to lift out what Docker is doing right now is they are leveraging Docker Compose to do specifically the ACI integrations. I haven't looked at the ECS ones because at the time we were recording this, the official announcement for ECS just came out yesterday.
Exactly.
Or the pre-release for ECS, whatever you want to call it. Specifically, it's ECS Fargate. So if you want to do stateful set, sorry. Because it is only supporting Fargate, if I remember.
Yes, Fargate with ECS as far as I know. So not EKS, not Kubernetes. With Fargate, only ECS.
Right. Yeah, so that's a very strong distinction because I forgot about Fargate being available for EKS. They're leveraging Docker Compose, which, if I remember right, we both sort of had buried a long time ago. Just because what was the use of Docker Compose if I'm living in a Kubernetes world? There was zero value. But now there's huge value.
I'm not yet sure whether it's huge, but there is value. I still cannot wrap around my head whether there is value or no, but that is not to a fault of Docker, but other powers, or to be more precise, the platforms that they are targeting. But yes, Compose suddenly becomes more interesting if you are going to use Azure Container Instances or ECS. So the whole idea is that you have Docker Compose file, or you keep running Docker run commands, and then the same thing more or less that you would do with your containers on your laptop, you can do in Azure Container Instances or ECS. So basically those two become extensions of your laptop and allow you to do over there more or less the same things as what you can do on your laptop. Now, the important thing is that this is unlikely ever going to become a way for you to run production for quite different reasons. Azure Container Instances, at least from my perspective, is not and will never be a service where you should run production load. Never.
Why?
Because Azure Container Instances is a way for us to run containers in isolation, meaning you cannot assemble a system with many different containers communicating with each other unless you want to go through external load balancer and what's not. And you cannot replicate your applications, so you cannot have more than one replica. So it is literally equivalent of Docker run. Not even Docker Compose that has multiple containers, literally Docker run. That's what it does. Docker run, no matter how tempting that might have seemed in the past, is not really how you run production. If you cannot scale, if you cannot load balance requests, if you cannot really treat storage networking and all that stuff, it's not going to be your production. But that does not necessarily mean that Azure Container Instances is a bad service or a bad idea, but rather recognizing for what it is. It allows you to run containers easily. Isolated containers, and I'm repeating, isolated containers. I can imagine some uses for that. Imagine local development where actually your laptop is not enough from capacity perspective. Or let's say development when you want to collaborate with others. Let's say that you and me now work on something and I want to show you what I just made. I can either give you access to my laptop by exposing it to internet and what's not, or I can just deploy it to Azure Container Instances. It can be a quick preview for you, right? Now, I still in my head don't have it clear how wide that usefulness can be, but it is what it is, let's say. While ECS is a completely opposite thing. ECS is a production-ready service. That's where you can run anything from a simple single replica application to very, very complex systems. But then, while ECS becomes much closer to what you would consider a platform to run production, it is equally further away from principles of Docker. And then I would be questioning, like, hey, would you really want to use Docker to run production on ECS, knowing that running production load in ECS means that you need to press 57,000 buttons and define 1,000 different things? It's a complex beast, right? If I just let Docker Compose create everything, and load balancer and the cluster and everything that ECS needs, then maybe that would be too much of a simplification, because no matter how much complex ECS is, it still requires us to control that complexity in a way. So that's where I see Docker as being potentially less useful, unless you're going to treat ECS in a similar way like Azure Container Instances, which is a valid option, because if your company is paying AWS, then yeah, why not spin up something quick that is not necessarily production ready, but it's useful for you as a developer? Then maybe. Those are two very different use cases, different destinations. And even if you look at the commands, you will see that they behave and feel very differently. The commands to deploy to container instances from Azure and ECS. One more thing, just before I forget, you mentioned Docker Compose. One curious thing is the change that, I don't know if you noticed, it took me a while to notice. It's not Docker-Compose. It's not Docker Compose binary anymore. But it is Docker space Compose. They're putting Compose functionalities back into Docker.
Why do you think that is?
I think that Docker is probably realizing that Compose might be their most valuable asset. And maybe want to put it all in one place. Because so what I'm going to say does not necessarily mean that that's really their strategy, but if I would be in their shoes, I would recognize, you know what? Docker machine, dead. Swarm, finished. And so on and so forth. So basically they're left with only, out of a big portfolio of tools, they're left with two, Docker and Docker Compose. So while separation into those two together with that 17 others made sense, when you have 20 tools, you want to separate them. But when you have two tiny tools, then maybe having one makes more sense from user perspective on the long run. But that's my guess. So
yeah,
I don't know the strategy for real.
Now you have worked with the ACI implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Have you worked with the ECS implementation yet, since it just announced?
Not sufficiently to judge it.
Okay. So the answer's no. That's okay to say no.
Let's say no. Let's say the answer is I used it. It failed to work in my case. After 2 attempts, I gave up. In a positive sense, because it is very, very early alpha, beta, whatever it is. So
yeah.
I cannot judge them for me not being able to succeed using it. So I give up for now. I will revisit the subject, let's say, a month or two from now.
Yes, because, and this is the other thing too, as of, we're recording this on Thursday, the 30th, good grief, 30th of July. The notification came out yesterday, and it's still in the experimental channel. So if you're still running the stable channel, you won't see these features. So do you want to break your local Docker to play with some stuff you may not use? That's your choice.
I mean, to be honest, I cannot guarantee, of course, but I cannot recall the last time Docker or ever Docker breaking something. Having a feature that doesn't work as expected, yeah, but they're very good at isolating stuff. Actually, and this is curious, you do get Docker as a single binary that you today need to download from the Edge channel, which is experimental features channel. But Azure Container Instances is a separate project, completely separate from Docker. And ECS is a separate project with separate GitHub repository. It's just that when they built the binary, they combined multiple repositories and then build the binary and you get things combined. What I'm trying to say with that is that if something is broken in, let's say, ECS, that is pretty separate from the rest. It wouldn't really break your Docker or anything like that, or not very likely.
That's interesting because I have not dug into it that deep. They're producing a monolith from a bunch of different repositories.
Yes, they're assembling different repositories into one, like, call it monolith, yes. Which is, in a way...
So here's where I'm going with that. And this is not the topic of this episode, but it seems like logically, the Docker binary would have been everything that's related to the Docker binary would have been in a single mono repo and not separate repositories if you follow standard convention.
Yes, but I'm not sure even actually whether monorepos are used, where the primary objective of monorepos is to assemble one big binary. At least that's not what I'm seeing usually. It's rather that they're used so that each application in monorepo can be built separately, but there are interdependencies between all those. So it's more convenient to keep them in the same repo.
Yeah. Again, that's not the purpose of this episode, but the way that you stated it, with a number of my clients that are still monorepo, they say, well, there's no way I could ever decompose my application into separate repositories. That would be too hard because everybody wants to have everything sitting inside of their favorite IDE without having to switch between different repositories.
You're touching the nerve now, and I'm doing my best not to explode because that would result in another 20 minutes or so.
Well, this takes us back to the very beginning of developer productivity. And we'll save this for later, but what is true developer productivity? True developer productivity isn't having everything open up and in a single window in your IDE. It's part of it, but it's not true developer productivity.
Yeah. I'm thinking now aloud, if I would need to state one thing that makes developers more productive than less, I would say that is independence. The ability to work within a team, preferably small team, unconstrained from the rest of the work of the company. That's probably the most important in my head, the most important factor that determines somebody's productivity.
If you're using ACI, if you're using ECS, and going back to the example that you gave of, hey, I need people to be able to review what I've done, but I don't want to poke a hole on my laptop. I don't want to use something like ngrok or some other reverse coming in to my machine, and I can deploy to ACI or ECS. Done deal, right?
Exactly.
And let's say you are going ECS, which is more productionized. I'm using the word, not your word. I see plenty of applications, production level applications running on ECS.
Yes.
So let's say I'm not an Azure shop, I am an AWS shop, and we use ECS a lot. As a developer, depending on, again, how large the application is, how much interdependencies there are, the thing that I write as a developer could be re-leveraged by the operations team to actually manage it long term.
Yep.
It's too early to say, but it seems like it's leaning in that direction.
Maybe. I suspect really that Docker is going, as a company now, is going out of its way to separate itself from anything production related. That's what my gut tells me. Bad experience. I think that they realize that they failed, because production is really what you sell to companies. That is what we package as enterprise solution and all that stuff, right? They're going away from that. I think that they're really targeting developers. ECS, let's face it, I mean, both of our personal experiences with different companies, hey, ECS production is never going to be Docker Compose up from developer terminal.
No.
It's not going to be.
But it could be from Docker Compose up from a Terraform or Ansible playbook.
Yes, I'm not sure, because what is happening that's why support for Azure Container Instances is to me potentially more interesting. ECS, simply what it does is it spins up or runs a few CloudFormation templates, of which you have absolutely no control. No control whatsoever. No knobs, no switches, nothing. Just default ones. That is the part that is, from my perspective, very unlikely to be acceptable for most companies. For production, just to clarify. Now, as far as I know, there is no attempt, at least not now, to do compose up inside of the existing ECS cluster. That might change. If it does, then yes, why not? What might be successful if it replaces container definition for ECS, which is typically that JSON file that is not CloudFormation, just JSON, very reminiscent of Docker Compose. But yeah, then maybe.
If you're interested in either ACI or ECS or both, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but if you're not trying to do something totally fancy and you just need to run a container, and let's say you wanted to have an experiment, and you wanted to experiment, okay, I want to spin up a container, and let's make this just a normal 3-tier application for a moment. It's an API call.
Mm-hmm.
I would spin up an ACI-based container. I would spin up an ECS-based container. I would use some third-party database service. Mongo as a service. Redis is, I don't care, just as a service. And then put Cloudflare in front of it and see what happens.
Yeah, we should
Right?
do that. We should do that experiment. Some kind of tutorial. That would be fun.
That's lightweight. Not only do you get multi-region, you get multi-vendor.
Yeah.
Now, your application has to be architected in a very specific way. It's got to be simple.
To be written in 21st century.
Yes. Preferably actually in 2020. Because it's all in the edge. I misspoke experimental. I knew it was an E word. I forgot it was edge. But, man, this is good news for all developers. And this is actually great news for Docker, I believe.
Yes. If you're ACI user, if you're Azure user, I have absolutely no reservation. Just use it. it makes no sense not to use that feature. Absolutely no sense not to use. If you're already ACI user. ECS, I think that it will take at least half a year minimum until that is anything close to be really GA, the feature from Docker. So let's say that we need to wait a bit more. But ACI, if you're Azure user, just go for it right now, immediately. Use memory on your laptop to play some games while you're running your containers in ACI.
If you made it this far, next week, we're going to go a little bit deeper, not specifically about the Docker Compose things we've been talking about today, but much like the other episode where you were talking about functions as a service, next week we're going to talk about containers as a service across the big three. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, if you liked our functions as a service episode where we compared the big three, get your seatbelts ready, because next week we're comparing containers as a service. We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.